Yes. Good after, or I guess good morning. We're back. We're back and we're talking about H72. And we have Tim Lueders Dumont.
Hold on.
Okay. From Legislative and Assistant Appellant Attorney in the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, here to talk with us a little more about this legislation. So thank you very much for coming. And since you know everyone here, we won't go around and introduce, but we're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Tim Lueders Dumont, Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. And so in looking at this bill 72, I see it's been greatly amended and changed since I think the introduced version. There was a version I think published earlier this week that I took a glance at last night, and I haven't taken a deep dive, and I'll preface by saying our state's attorneys may have really different opinions on this, which is a really nice place for me to be in because I don't have to, sort of stamp up really firm policy position. But certainly, this is a policy choice that feels very clearly in the lane of this committee. Appreciate the conversation on it, and I enjoyed chatting with Representative Whitman on an ancillary topic on H222. But as an overarching topic, the real drivers of criminal justice reform practices are driven by prosecutorial discretion in the United States. And that goes back to the founding of the country. Most states did not have or may not have had an attorney general, but they've often had county prosecution. And so there is that tie. On the one side, you hear geographic disparities and equities. On the other hand, you hear things like local control, local decision making, which we also value. So I always want to kind of preface that by saying that in Vermont, state's attorneys have often been the drivers of reform, and I think that will continue. And so when looking at something like H72, I see it's mostly about Section 1 seems to have combined Section 2 a bit from the prior version, talking about overdose prevention sites, and a few topics in surveying some of our state's attorneys, and we've also chatted about this issue, is a couple of what I call flags that are just to think through. In the United States, there isn't a lot of information on this yet. I know Oregon has had some struggles that have been recently published. But that's not quite about overdose prevention. It's more about alternative pathways. For example, giving someone a fine as opposed to them voluntarily engaging with treatment. We know that it's hard. People are dealing with the overwhelming issues of substance use. They are not going to always voluntarily engage with treatment. They are going to maybe often engage with the fine process because of the control and lack of autonomy, really, to engage with voluntary treatment. And so with that, treatment courts, federal courts, state courts are doing it. New Hampshire's done a good job of it. Vermont's done a good job of it. But there are gaps in our system here in Vermont that, I was just talking with the representative from Addison, and, Addison County feels like it's not far from a lot of services and it has good services, but it doesn't have a treatment court. The Northeast Kingdom doesn't have a treatment court. And I'm not saying that that's the panacea, but we know that for crimes involving victims, it's helpful for them too, because they see, oh, this person's going through this process. They have to engage with accountability. They're getting wraparound services. They're, in many cases, staying alive. And that's the whole point, harm reduction, because it doesn't matter if you convict someone if they're not able to stay engaged, stay alive, stay healthy. So I'm a huge advocate for our treatment court programs, and it's working. And it does have a little bit of that hook of, you can mess up a few times because they're human beings. It takes a lot of tries, and treatment court allows for that. There's sanctioned processes that happen, but when I think about overdose prevention, I also want this community to just stay on the ball with empowering treatment court programs in Vermont to continue to do the work that they're doing. That we've seen that success. Having been a prosecutor here in Washington County, the overlap between drug trafficking, and when I say trafficking, I mean sort of the bigger type issues, and I would also say dispensing. Possession cases are happening to go through diversion, Tamarack. Like, our prosecutors are not prosecuting pure possession cases anymore. That's going through diversion, going through Tamarack. Mental health, substance use, it's all combined. The trafficking cases do have a lot of overlap with firearm violence and human trafficking. And so who are the victims of human trafficking and firearm violence? Black men and women. And so victims of crime in Vermont are disproportionately people of color and individuals who experience a disability. So when you're thinking about drug trafficking, there's all these sort of co-occurring incidents. And I want to pause on that because in thinking about overdose prevention sites, the equity issues, right? As I was just talking with the representative from Avison, Burlington is experiencing, and Chittenden County is experiencing a lot of overdose issues. So it's important to understand that that's one segment. And also someone up in the Northeast Kingdom, someone in Orange County, sort of hiding in plain sight. I want to make sure that the issues of something like transportation issues of equity, issues of liability, if it's a volunteer assisting with something as opposed to an employee, how that's being considered, and what happens in a situation where one segment of our population is really being served better and in the future, and you got to always do that. But the rural expanse in Vermont is not enjoying that same level. It doesn't mean not to investigate the other stuff for a place that has better access. But I do have concerns about that equity and access and transportation populations that are already more vulnerable being continuously underserved. And so most of our state's attorneys have really thought about that issue a bit and talking with them about overdose prevention sites. And they all agree that, harm reduction should be a part of any solution. But they also want to flag that figuring out how to do it in a way so that someone doesn't have to drive. And then when they leave too, we know that traffic related fatalities related to substance use is on the major increase in the United States, including in Vermont. And so what does the liability look like on the tail end? Let's say someone goes into a site, has a successful experience in terms of not dying, but then has to depart and then kill someone on the road afterwards. That has been an issue, and it's not just on what we would call downers. It's also in things like crack and cocaine that fentanyl is being laced into, xylazine is being laced into, where someone might be expecting, for lack of a better term, to be quite alert because they've taken something that's an upper, which may not inhibit them from having control over their bodily functions. But laced within it is that heavy downer. And there was a recent case last year of a number of individuals who were West Point students who all overdosed and died from cocaine inhalation on spring break. They were obviously not expecting that. So that's just something to kind of pause and consider, that the landscape, as Representative Whitman was testifying downstairs earlier, is really constantly changing. Tranq or xylazine has been a recent infusion. Next year it could be something else. And so keeping these conversations going, knowing that the market is always changing, and that Vermont is a very, very profitable location to traffic narcotics, and that usually local individuals who are already incredibly vulnerable, people who are dealing with substance use, are the ones that are the tools to that trade, for lack of a better term, and it's a dehumanizing trade by its very nature. So with that, I would sort of generally echo some of the concerns Dr. Levine has echoed with respect to making sure things are evidence-based, making sure things are based in practice here in the United States. I was invited to a family wedding in Portugal. I could not go because it was during the session. I wanted to go for the purpose of actually investigating what was happening over there with their drug program. But I will note that Oregon has seen some really substantial hurdles to success in their programming. And I think with that, I'm happy to chat, having flagged a few things, but also appreciating that you all are talking about this with life preservation, harm reduction at the core of what you're doing.
So thank you very much. And so essentially, are you saying that you're not supportive of overdose prevention sites, or are you saying that you need just that you want to make sure to call attention to the things that you're worried about, or is it both?
I think that certain states attorneys are supportive. I know Sarah George has made comments on this before, been really at the forefront. Other states attorneys would probably be on the way end of that spectrum. All of them agree that harm reduction should be a focus. And I think what they would probably say is, if you're going to move forward in this lane, make sure that you're accounting for things like transportation, equity, liability, not furthering disparities, and understanding that drug trafficking does have these co-occurring things like firearm violence, domestic violence happens in these circumstances. And we also can't forget that alcohol is still like a co-occurring thing with all this as well. And I mean, I used to do a lot of the DUI cases here in Washington County. It was pretty rare that someone was just dealing with a substance use issue relating to alcohol. It's often a lot of issues in their life. And so I would say it's a complicated question, and I can't represent that all of them feel one way, unfortunately.
You just wanted to make sure to call attention to it, it sounds like. And I get what you're saying, but I'm not sure overdose prevention sites make any of those things worse. They are there in our communities no matter what. And it's important. I mean, earlier in the beginning of your testimony, you talked a little bit about the treatment courts. Yeah. And it is unfortunate that we don't have treatment courts in all of our counties. Is that due to just not enough funds, or?
So the judiciary could probably answer that better than me, but one of the issues is, unfortunately, for lack of a term, volume. People say, oh, there's only 3 people in Addison County that might really qualify for this. Well, that's not a reason not, just like we're talking about, it's not a reason not to do something in Chittenden County. It's not a reason not to do something for lack of volume. And also, as we know, folks in Addison or Orange County or up in the Northeast Kingdom are probably seeking services in another location. So we have people who are participants in all of our drug treatment courts that are not residents of the county where that treatment court is located. Many people from outside of Chittenden County are enjoying a really robust program run by Sarah George's office and the judiciary up there and the defense bar up there, who are not residents of Chittenden County. Likewise, Northeast Kingdom residents might gravitate towards Washington County a little bit. And so I think that when you're thinking about overdose prevention sites as being harm reduction for the individuals who are justice involved, which is kind of where I want to stay in my lane, people where there's been accusation of a crime, the great trend we've seen with treatment courts is it used to be what felt like low-level cases. Those low-level cases, if you think about sort of a change in intercept, are now going to diversion and Tamarack. So those cases are often being dismissed eventually for successful engagement with diversion and Tamarack. The higher level cases, perhaps something involving a firearm, something involving a burglary, theft, where there's a real victim involved. It used to be that those were not going to treatment court, but now we know they are. And so that's good. The sort of higher level, we know there can be success even for really high level cases. A difficult one to think about is the ones where there's a fatal overdose. That's not just a pure transfer of drugs. There's things that are happening involved where, like, the person was being trafficked in some way, or the person may have been involved in firearm distribution. So that's why it kind of elevates it. But I think the panacea concept is the flawed one, whether it's overdose prevention sites or treatment court. It's kind of going to be all in. And the gaps in treatment are not due, the gaps in how individuals in Vermont are treated, as much as I think it's easy to sort of say it's this or that, it has to do with what's happening way upstream. And so people that are not accessing things like housing, a job market that pays them a livable wage, all that sort of, those people are much more likely to be underserved also in this venue.
Representative Small and then Representative.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Thank you, Tim, for being here today. Definitely hear you and agree that this is not the panacea. This is not the ultimate solution, but a tool in the toolbox nonetheless. And I hear you keep coming back to trafficking. And I just want to try to understand the connection here of drug or human trafficking and the connection to overdose prevention sites.
Yeah, so when I think we're understanding that what I'm trying to talk about for the most part is justice involved individuals. I can't speak to individuals that are not having any interactions with law enforcement. That OPS type of pathway, I think, is something for you all to consider. But in terms of individuals that are justice involved, if you're doing things like thinking about immunity, thinking about what if there's a co-occurring criminal conduct event that's happening at or around or leading to an OPS site. I was looking at section 1 and thinking about the following shall not be cited, arrested, or prosecuted. And whenever I see the word shall and it has to do with prosecution, I pause, not because I don't think it's worthy of discussion, but because it ultimately is a hit on prosecutorial discretion to charge or not, which is something that's happening every single day. So if a crime, for example, like an individual is being held against their will at a house, or maybe they own the house and someone's coming in to sort of use the location to distribute firearms or to collect firearms to go out of state. That's a co-occurring type of event. And just thinking about how OPS might be involved in that is something I can't figure out all the contours of that, but for a justice involved person, not having the ability to go upstream and say, let's just say a woman or a man walks into an OPS site and says, I'm here because I have concerns about my well-being, I'm taking this substance, et cetera. What's happening out in the car or the location that they just came from, it might be important to have a conversation with that person about getting them help through a treatment court facility. And then we're also able to have that person assist with what else is going on in your life? Are your children safe? You know, that sort of thing. And we read kind of awful affidavits, which can hopefully don't skew our lens. But the broad-based kind of immunity for it would have to be kind of narrow, right? That we couldn't not proceed with something that might be really serious, life-threatening, not just on the drug side, but on a sort of violence side. But I hear what you're saying as well. But that was a comment I wanted to make. What if there's a co-occurring crime happening in, around, or relating to an OPS site? And what are the best, I see there's a lot in here about kind of setting up best practices, et cetera, and making sure that that's happening in a really uniform manner, because I really wanted to pause on, with all due respect to people that work in the medical fields, doctors were at the forefront of the opioid crisis in the United States. And that's something that we can't really ignore. And it doesn't mean that doctors are not so on the forefront of assisting people too. But it's something just to think about, that pharma and doctors pushed this into our market 25 years ago with respect to the lawful distribution of opioids in the United States, and thinking about that in OPS, being really careful about it. So it's not another location where someone has it's a lawful oversight over someone engaging. We also know that can be an access point to someone having a downward spiral when they've been doing really well too. And that's something we talked about, people traveling the treatment court out of the community where they live. They can have a spiral type event because they're not being served locally.
Representative Whitman has a question as well. And I think I just got something that I didn't hear, which is the immunity piece of this might be an issue. Is that right?
Yeah, if I may, I would welcome any language changes that you would offer, because intentionally the immunity here is so that folks utilizing the services purely for utilizing the services, not committing a crime, are protected, especially folks who are running the facilities or engaged. Thinking to your point earlier about what about the volunteers in these services, and they are currently covered in this language. So,
and one thing just on that I wanted to note is, what does it look like? The robust nature of a site might look different. So someone having a house where they really, maybe the only place to do something in a kind of rural, remote part of Vermont is not really equipped to do what is required. And best efforts aside, concepts of good faith aside, we don't want someone that's going into let's say a home is transferred into an OPS site. And in Burlington, for example, maybe it's not that, right? What does that location look like? And I think intentions aside, I'm just flagging that a property owner who owns real property at which an overdose prevention site is located, looking at what that looks like would be really important.
right, and all of these sites would have to be supported and established by the Department of Health beforehand, so not just any.
No, and I absolutely wasn't sure. The rest of the language kind of lays that out, but I think concepts of federal law as well, I think, are important, as Vermont's dealt with the marijuana and cannabis topics. That's another thing to think about, how federal law, federal funding into Vermont, which we're so reliant on, might be impacted by this sort of thing.
Okay. Representative.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Thank you, Tim, for your testimony. I just wanted to ask a question. So I think there's one part of the conversation and part of your testimony that I think that is about resources, right? And how do we prioritize this within our continuum of services, right? And I think that's one conversation to have. But then there's sort of like just the proof and concept of it, right? And so we're talking about a situation where basically a provider that's supporting somebody with an active substance use disorder, it doesn't stop when they say, here are the harm reduction tools you need. Now leave the building, please, because you can't be in the building under law, right? And so that person may be using alone, and that increases their risk of fatal overdose, right? I just wanted to key in on one piece because you talked about local discretion versus kind of the need for statewide statutory action. Now, I've been under the impression that one of the reasons that we're taking this up, even though there have been like proposed pilots in a few areas, is that we need to take this statewide action. We need to put into statute liability protections for that act of having an overdose prevention site where a person is using a regulated drug under the supervision of a provider. Do you see a scenario where this could be handled on a state's attorney by state's attorney basis? Could this just be like a memorandum of understanding?
Yeah, and thinking about, H222 a little bit, it could. I heard Dr. Levine's testimony about the need for immunity so that you can have the services. Immunity is offered every day in cases that never see the light of day to protect individuals from the engagement. The more serious cases, people's identities are never revealed. I think it would depend. Mm-hmm. But I understand, I've heard that need for immunity, but then also the need for evidence-based practices here. And that's not my lane at all. Right. So I would defer to the health experts on that.
And then we're setting up somewhat of a open way for the Department of Health to establish those guidelines based off evidence, based off those practices. But I'm just wondering about that liability piece, if that is something that could happen with local discretion.
Yeah, I certainly would support that. A structure, like open architecture, where you set up the ability to, and then you have that local buy-in and local stakeholder input, because I think things are more successful when you engage the local service providers and also the local justice involved folks, because that's not the place we all want to be in, is where people who are experiencing substance use disorder, they're also very, very often victims of crimes too. So we want them to be able to talk to law enforcement too about the crimes they're experiencing. So immunity kind of goes multiple different directions. One example I'll use is in the alcohol enforcement, where someone has been overserved at a bar, et cetera. Sometimes in DUI cases, we offer immunity to individuals so they can engage with that alcohol enforcement overserving situation that's ancillary to the criminal process. And nothing they say during that process can be used during the criminal prosecution.
Okay. Last question. It looks like Representative.
My question was answered. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for stopping in. A few of you came in a little bit late unless you saw your phone. You would notice that. This was a surprise witness. So
It's always the best ones at trial, though.
yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And welcome to Dr. Marshall, who's with us virtually. Hello, and we usually have a practice of going around and introducing ourselves when, really?
He came in earlier for overdose
Might have
prevention.
not been here. So you've already met the committee, right?
I know
probably
some of
wasn't-
you, yes. But feel free to do a round again, or I can jump right in, whatever works for you, honestly.
Okay, well, if you've met everyone, why don't we just jump right in? That sounds great. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to share some slides because I'm an academic, and that's what we
That's what we do.
Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So thanks again, everyone, for inviting me to present. I've going to be speaking about overdose prevention centers. I have studied these facilities for more than a decade. I did my doctoral training in Vancouver, Canada, where the first sanctioned OPC was located, and have been working also here in Rhode Island to implement and soon to evaluate OPCs. So my intent today is to offer you the best available evidence on OPCs based on this experience and the literature, which is fairly robust from other countries. Feel free to stop me throughout if you have any questions, just feel free to do so and we'll get through the material here. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. There we go. So I'd just like to set the stage that the overdose crisis has been evolving over 4 decades in the United States. We've actually seen exponential growth in drug overdose mortality rates since the 1980s. So this is a crisis that's affecting every community and is truly a national tragedy. I took the liberty of plotting the deaths in 2020 and 2021, which in fact are super exponential, really, I think, due to the manifold impacts of the COVID pandemic exacerbating this existing long crisis. So, you know, a health crisis that's been going on for this long is really going to take monumental and generational efforts to solve it. I also took some data from Vermont that you might be probably are aware of already. This is a graph from Kaiser Health News that shows overdose mortality rates in Vermont compared to the US average, which is shown in yellow. So the overall drug overdose rates are shown in squares, and the opioid-related overdose deaths, which typically account for between 80 and 85% of all deaths now, are shown in the circles. And as you can see, historically, Vermont was below the national average on both of these classes of drug overdose deaths. And sadly and tragically, those rates have really skyrocketed during the COVID-19 pandemic and have quintupled since 2009. So that's where we are today. So, you know, I want to make sure that we highlight that we need a robust, comprehensive response to this crisis. I'm going to talk about OPCs today. They are one evidence-based strategy to address overdose deaths and are ultimately part of a broader continuum of care to deal with this crisis. But in brief, OPCs are spaces where people can consume pre-obtained substances under the supervision of trained staff. They might be nurses, trained peers, in some cases, other kinds of providers, and they intervene in the event of an overdose or another kind of medical emergency. But OPCs are a lot more than the immediate supervision of consumption. In the vast majority of OPCs around the world, clients can also access medical care and other support services, including referrals to treatment programs. In some OPCs, there's actually a direct co-location of treatment programs, say above or beside the actual consumption room. And we can talk more about the different ways in which these programs can be structured to meet the needs of the population and the clients. There are more than 200 operating in more than 14 countries. This is not a new intervention globally. The first OPC was opened in Switzerland in the 1980s. So fortunately, although these are novel in the US, we have a lot of evidence from other countries to understand how they work in these places. The terminology is a little bit confusing. We're, I think, landing on the term OPC in national discussions, but you might see the term drug consumption room used more often in Europe. In our Rhode Island law, we use the term harm reduction center, but are colloquially referring to them as OPCs. So for the purposes of today, they're all sort of the same. So I want to take you through a few models of OPCs now. And then just highlight a few of research studies that I've been involved with and have been done. I want to take you into Insight, which is the first OPC that opened in North America in Vancouver in September of 2003. This is what I call a Cadillac facility. This is a very large standalone fixed site facility with 12 booths. It serves many hundreds of people per day in the downtown East Side neighborhood of Vancouver. When people enter, they register at a front desk and then enter the consumption room, which is shown in the photo. There are 12 booths, which you can see in the background of the photo, where people use pre-obtained substances under the supervision of nurses who are standing in the foreground of the photo at a nursing station. Those nurses also provide safer use equipment, provide injecting or drug use education, risk reduction practices, and other referrals to social services. The mirrors in the booths allow those nurses to passively observe and can intervene in the event of an overdose, providing oxygen or naloxone. Following consumption, clients move to a post-consumption room, and that's always where I say a lot of the magic actually happens. That's where there's more of those wraparound services that are typically available, access to providers. Insight has clinicians, psychiatrists, and in fact, a residential treatment program on the second and third floor of this facility. So an example of a co-located OPC within access to treatment as well. In America now, moving to New York City, this jurisdiction was the first to open locally recognized or sanctioned OPCs in the United States in November 2021. There are two models, two sites, one in East Harlem and one in Washington Heights. I'm showing here a photo of the East Harlem location, which is more medicalized. You can see it looks similar to Insight in many ways, with booths there and a nursing station with sterile use equipment in the foreground. The site in Washington Heights is more of a peer-run model and approach, and we can talk more about the relative benefits of these different models during the Q&A. They have now had the site accessed over 75,000 times since the site opened in November 2021, and have intervened on hundreds of overdoses successfully managed in the site itself. And that's something I really want to highlight, is that these facilities are able to manage overdoses on site, and that greatly reduces emergency room visits and EMS calls for overdoses. I think On Point has only had to call EMS 14 times since it opened in November 2021, usually for more complex medical emergencies like a stroke, for example. So that's a real health, but also economic benefit of these sites. I also want to highlight that these are, again, larger kind of Cadillac fixed site models. Around the world, we have lots of other modalities of overdose prevention centers. This one is actually in my hometown of Kelowna, Canada, which is a population of about 175,000. It's a converted RV, basically, and has two consumption booths, a nursing station, and then post-consumption room at the back of the RV. And this is a way to provide services in a more dispersed population than, say, in Manhattan, which is highly dense. The other photo on the right is an integrated OPC. This is, again, a small facility that's integrated into a program that serves people living with HIV. So it's not public, it's just available for people who are already accessing HIV care and therapy. I also wanted to get an example for you of a rural OPC. So I went north, very far north, to Grand Prairie, Alberta. This is almost 300 miles north of Edmonton. The population is about 65,000 people. You can see it in the photo. I took the liberty of looking at how far it would take to get there. It'd be a very long road trip. If you want to go on that road trip, it would take about 2,600 miles to get there from Burlington. An organization called Northreach opened in 2019 a mobile overdose prevention center that serves this community with access to treatment, recovery services, housing programs. They have several hundred clients who have accessed the service now thousands of times since 2019, have successfully managed about 200 overdoses in the mobile facilities. So this is a wonderful example of a more rural environment in which an OPC is successfully providing care and services. And I'm happy to introduce you to the directors of this program. They testified in our advisory committee here in Rhode Island, and were really very insightful and helpful at understanding how they provide these services in this rural, and I might add, very cold environment in Northern Canada. Oh, and here's a few photos that I pulled from their website showing you the inside of their facility with, again, 2 booths in this mobile clinic, nursing care and harm reduction supplies. So I want to move now to a little bit of the research that's been done. There are dozens of scientific peer-reviewed studies that have evaluated OPCs. I just want to highlight a few for you to leave lots of time for questions. So I'm going to hit on 3 main questions that we and other teams have sought to answer. The first is whether OPCs reduce community overdose rates. So this was a study that I was fortunate to lead and that we published in The Lancet in 2011. We know that that supervised consumption sites, overdose prevention centers, prevent and manage successfully overdoses in the sites themselves. But this was designed to determine whether that actually results in community level reductions in overdose mortality. So what I did with the research team here was basically work with our provincial coroner's office to obtain data on exactly where overdoses occurred in the city of Vancouver between January 2001 and December 2005. And we extracted information on where overdose deaths occurred down to the 6-digit postal code, which in an urban city in Canada is about half or one side, I should say, of a city block. We knew from data, from utilization data, that over 75% of people using this OPC reside within about 550 yards of the facility itself, who are, either living in what are called single room occupancy hotels or spending their most of the time in this neighborhood. And so we hypothesized that if there's an effect on community overdose mortality, we'd see it in that location. So we examined overdose mortality rates in city blocks within that catchment area, and then compared that to the change in overdose mortality in the rest of the city of Vancouver overall during that same time period. So I'm going to show you the results now. Within the downtown Eastside neighborhood, we found 56 overdose deaths before the OPC opened and 33 after. Remember, it opened in September 2003. So overall, that resulted in a 35% reduction in community overdose mortality after the OPC opened in that immediate neighborhood, compared to only a 9% reduction, which was statistically non-significant in the rest of the city of Vancouver overall. If you're a more visual person, this shows you the block-by-block changes in overdose mortality rates in that downtown East Side area, in that catchment area. The location of the OPC is shown in the red star. And we actually found reductions in overdose mortality in every single city block in which overdose deaths were occurring when we compared those rates before on the left versus after the the OPC opened. This was a really nice, more recent study that was published last year that was a long-term, what are called cohort studies, examining mortality rates among over 2,000 people who use drugs in the city of Vancouver. They've been followed every 6 months for more than 10 years now. So it's an incredibly rich study to understand the long-term outcomes associated with public health interventions like OPCs. These investigators linked OPC utilization data with vital records to look at whether the use of the OPC reduced the risk of all-cause mortality. And what they found was that people who use the OPC at least weekly had a 54% reduction in all-cause mortality compared to people who were using drugs who were not using that facility. So the protected, and the other thing I wanted to note, actually, this was interesting to me when I read this in more detail in advance of this testimony today was that overdoses in the study actually accounted for only 17% of all of the causes of death. The most common were the other common causes of death were suicides, liver-related diseases, and other causes like strokes, for example, and heart attacks. And so by looking at all-cause mortality, we can see a protective effect of OPC utilization beyond, I think, just the immediate overdose prevention, and that effect is observed with even using the site weekly, where we start to see that reduced risk of mortality emerge. So I want to move down to the second research question, which was understanding whether OPCs help people enter treatment. Again, focusing on that provision of wraparound services. This is a major public health goal of the vast majority of OPCs operating around the world. So this was a study that was done way back in 2011 using that same cohort of people who I presented and talked about in the earlier work. In this particular study, they looked at the 621 people who were not accessing any form of treatment before the OPC actually opened, and then looked at what happened as it opened in terms of treatment uptake over time. And what they found was that after about 2 years of follow-up, 42% of people not in some form of treatment at baseline had entered into treatment after 2 years. And on the figure on the right, this is from what's called a Cox proportional hazards model that looks at basically what are the things associated with more rapid time to uptake of something. So if the value is above 1, that means that those variables were associated with more rapid time to uptake of, in this case, treatment. And what they found was that regularly attending the OPC, and importantly, having contact with peer counselors in that post-consumption room, were some of the factors that really sped up the time to treatment uptake in this research study, in addition to having a history of any treatment, which makes sense because we know that people often have very long trajectories of engagement in multiple forms of SUD treatment. So just finally now, before I talk about some neighborhood level impacts, I wanted to highlight this really nice study from France that came out last year. One limitation that is often pointed to in discussions of OPCs is that the vast majority of the research comes out of Canada. So I'd just like to highlight this study, which looked at people using OPCs in 4 cities in France and compared their health outcomes to people who use drugs who were accessing other kinds of harm reduction services, but not overdose prevention centers. And what they found in this study is that people who used the OPC had reduced overdose rates by 67%, reduced rates of skin abscesses, which decreased by 79%, and reduced rates of emergency room visits, which was down by 59%, all compared to people who were using other harm reduction services, really demonstrating the benefit, I think, of OPCs in addition to more traditional, say, syringe service programs. So finally, before I would be thrilled to answer some questions, I just want to talk about some of the impact that OPCs have on neighborhood level conditions. This is something that we're going to be studying very comprehensively as an OPC opens here in Rhode Island in early 2024. So this was a question that was also important to answer in Vancouver. So I just want to show you that data now. This is a really nice study design that basically asks students and research assistants to systematically canvass the downtown East Side neighborhood in the 6 weeks prior to the OPC opening and in the 12 weeks after it opened. And they systematically counted basically the number of publicly discarded syringes, the number of people they saw injecting drugs in public, and the amount of drug-related litter in that neighborhood before and after the facility opened. And what they found was significant reductions in all 3 of those measures of neighborhood-related disorder after the OPC opened, which is shown in that dashed line. And that was associated with increased utilization of the OPC as it opened, which you can see in the top left figure. I wanted to finish by also highlighting this study, which came from an unsanctioned OPC that is operating in the United States. The authors do not disclose where this location is because it is operating illegally. But it gives us some important data on what outcomes could look like in a US context, right? So in this study, they looked at crime. They looked at police incident reports in the neighborhood around where the OPC opened. That's shown by the green line. So those dots represent essentially standardized counts of police incident reports in that neighborhood where the OPC opened, which is shown in the dashed line. And then 2 control neighborhoods, one that was immediately adjacent to the neighborhood in which the OPC opened, that's shown in red. And then the blue control neighborhood is a neighborhood in the city that is most similar to the neighborhood that the OPC opened based on overdose rates and sociodemographic characteristics. So you can see a little bit of a different story here depending on which control neighborhood you're looking at. But nonetheless, you see that actually reversal of police incident reports after the OPC opened in that particular neighborhood. All right, so just to finish out now, I do want to highlight what we're doing here in Rhode Island. We were the first state in the nation to authorize OPCs through legislation. This was a law that was passed and signed by the governor in July of 2021. That law does a couple of things. It required our state Department of Health to develop regulations that would license OPCs. OPCs will not be operated by the health department in Rhode Island, but will be licensed by, will license them just like other healthcare facilities. And this was done with an advisory council. And I have to say, I'm really impressed with the final product. The link is there. I can also send it to the committee if you're interested in reading the regulations. The goal here is to make sure that these are open safely and that provide a minimum suite of services for clients, but can also operate in a low threshold manner that we know is important to making sure that it's accessible to the broadest number of people who are at risk for overdose possible. So those regulations were finalized in 2022. Organizations wishing to open an OPC can now apply to the health department for a license. That so far has not happened. And I get a lot of questions about why. It really comes down to funding. You know, these sites do require investment. Many studies have found them to be not only cost effective, but cost saving because of the averted overdoses and other healthcare outcomes that are associated with their utilization, but they do require investment. And so very recently in January of this year, our state opioid settlement committee and our Secretary of Health approved spending $2.6 million on their implementation this fiscal year. That contract was actually just announced last week, and an organization called Project Weber Renew is receiving that funding to implement and open an OPC, which will likely happen in early spring of 2024. So that's all I have. I just want to thank all of the staff that I work with and the study participants for their contributions to this research, and my colleagues as well in New York City and in Vancouver for their mentorship and collaboration. And then funding as well came originally from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. We are also receiving funding to do an OPC evaluation from Open Society Foundations and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And with that, I want to just finish, but flash my email address in case you have any additional questions. It's just brandon_marshall@brown.edu. And with that, I'll stop a share and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. That was incredibly interesting. And especially, I'm actually from Rhode Island. So is the site going to be in Providence?
Yes, the site will be in Providence. It is going to be, so Project Weber Renew is a harm reduction organization which runs 2 syringe service programs. They are partnering with an opioid treatment provider, methadone clinics, basically, the largest in the state, which will provide the medical services. And so that OTP, opioid treatment program, is vacating a space and moving to a different building in Providence. And they're essentially going to then have the OPC take over in that location. So it'll be located in sort of a funny neighborhood. It's, sort of southwest Providence, I would say, but certainly in an area where we see a lot of need for these services. So, I think epidemiologically, it makes a lot of sense to locate an OPC where the need is, and that's indeed the case in Providence.
That's so interesting. I visit Warwick regularly, and there are a lot of issues in that area as well.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
That's very interesting. I also earlier, right before your testimony, we heard from a gentleman from our state's attorneys association who talked a bit about concerns around immunity, sort of liability, it sounded like, and just curious if you've talked about those issues. And also for me, I like that you went to the crime piece, because I'm also curious as far on that same sort of discussion about, have there been many studies to look at whether or not they're more of a target for people who are addicted and don't have the drugs they need and might come there thinking people are coming there with drugs, and that it would be, do you know what I'm saying? I'm just curious about that too.
Yep, definitely. So I can address those two things. I am not super familiar with the nuances of the immunity protections and the liability issue, not being a lawyer. So that's not something I like to, try to go too far beyond my area of expertise. But I do know that that is addressed in our state law, and is one challenge, honestly, to finding, say, a company that's willing to insure the services. But that has been done successfully in New York City. On Point does have insurance, medical liability insurance. So it is being done. I just need to honestly learn a little bit more about it. So it is something to consider as we implement laws and policies around OPCs. But it's not by any means an insurmountable challenge. And I can get back to you with how exactly that is addressed in our state legislation as well, if you'd like. And then the issue of crime is really interesting, and that's why I'd like to highlight those findings. Typically, in the vast majority of studies that have been done, we do not see what is called a honeypot effect. These do not serve as magnets for people who are not already in the neighborhood to come in and procure or use drugs. In fact, the opposite occurs. We typically see no change or reductions in drug-related arrests or other neighborhood low-level crime. These facilities, I should say, are most effective, though, when they are implemented in partnership with law enforcement. And that is certainly what's happening in New York City. I was very fortunate to meet one of the commissioners at a conference recently at the NYPD. And she talked very eloquently about how they work in partnership with On Point. So if they see someone, say, using in public, they will typically now escort them to On Point, or at least make them aware of those services. So that kind of partnership is really the optimal approach, I would say. At the same time, the OPC needs to be good neighbors. If you go to the northreach.ca website, they have a whole document on the the good neighbor policy that they have to make sure that they're contributing positively to the neighborhoods in which that mobile van is being located. So that might look like doing volunteer cleanup days or other types of services, or doing outreach as well to try to make sure that people who aren't typically using the service are aware of it and are engaged. So it's a two-way street, if that makes sense. You need ideally like buy-in and partnership on both parties to see maximal public health and also neighborhood benefit.
That's great. Thank you. And Representative Whitman has a question.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and thank you, Dr. Marshall, for visiting us again. My question had to do related to what we have in H722 now. We say that the Department of Health shall develop operating guidelines for overdose prevention centers. And meanwhile, Rhode Island has a, regulatory process that includes licensing.
Yeah. And
I was just wondering if you could comment on your sense of that difference and the significance of it.
Mm-hmm. I was privy to some of those conversations, not all. I think at the time the thought was, we're going to be we didn't, New York City had not moved forward at this point publicly. So I think a lot of folks here were operating under the assumption we might be the first. And the directive from the director of health at Department of Health at the time was, let's make sure that we do this rigorously, comprehensively, and can also maximize public health benefit, i.e. not make these facilities so high threshold that they're impossible to open. So that was the balance that was trying to being struck. And I think it was felt that through licensing, there would be sufficient oversight to make sure that required services were indeed being provided. It also allows the health department to conduct inspections, for example, of the facility to make sure, even things like oxygen is readily available, there's egress plans, and so on and so forth. My personal opinion is that I don't know that that's always required. There are lots of guidelines around the world. I'm happy to send some, and the vast majority of OPCs, I think, can operate very successfully under those more guidance type models. But here in Rhode Island, as we were embarking on this process, I think the thought was, let's have a little bit more licensing and oversight because we are the first state to actually embark on this. One important piece of discussion that came up during these discussions was around ensuring services for people who are not injecting. We know from our surveillance data that, in fact, we have a disproportionate number of Rhode Islanders of color who are inhaling or smoking crack cocaine that's contaminated with fentanyl. And we're seeing some of the fastest increases in overdose mortality rates among Black Rhode Islanders, which we believe is because of that issue. And so the advisory committee did actually mandate that the services need to provide facilities for inhalation of substances. And so that's actually where a lot of the discussions were focused on, was making sure that there are services for what are called multimodality consumption beyond just injection, which is more historically the case in Canada.
Yes, Representative Small.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. And thank you, Dr. Marshall, for being here today. I have a few questions for you. The first one being, you mentioned unsanctioned facilities, and I was wondering if you could define that more clearly for the committee as to what an unsanctioned facility is.
Yeah. So I'm learning this language as well as we embark on this process. So the sites, for example, in New York City are not operating actually under state authorization. They're publicly recognized by the city of New York. They're essentially operating under MOUs with the city that also involves, say, the Manhattan District Attorney and other entities like the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So that's publicly recognized because you have city governments saying, we recognize this as a service and we are supporting it in X, Y, and Z manners. So the term that they're preferring is a publicly recognized or sanctioned facility. Ours will be state authorized because of the law and the licensing and regulatory procedures, which we've already discussed. So unsanctioned facilities would be facilities that are operating under none of those frameworks. They're essentially underground, right? And those do exist in the United States. I'm aware of more than one. Some have been operating for quite a while by typically harm reduction organizations that are providing modes or ways of supervised consumption essentially under the radar. So the researchers can and do study these facilities. And that is why we have some of the research that I showed you today, but they're not operating with the public recognition of a city or county, for example. Does that answer your question?
It absolutely does. It almost sounds like unsanctioned is also unregulated since there is no body overseeing that
That's right.
facility.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Next question is focused on rural communities. Of course, we come back to this often as a very rural state here in Vermont. And wondering if you have any evidence or insight into best practices when initiating overdose prevention centers or strategies in rural communities. I know you highlighted up at Northreach. We were very lucky to have Dallas in yesterday to discuss their mobile program, but didn't know if you had additional thoughts on that.
You know, I think the first step is to always engage with the population who's going to use these facilities. So, you know, there needs to be some way to understand, speak with people who are at risk for overdose and using drugs. You know, what are the services that you need? What are some of the barriers? We did this kind of needs assessment work in Somerville, Massachusetts, and people we spoke to were overwhelmingly concerned about police interference, entering or leaving the site, or being surveilled in some other way, or having their personal health information, say, that might be collected at an OPC being released to law enforcement and other entities. So there was a lot of concerns about privacy and police interference. So that helped, I hope, like determine the next steps in terms of where Somerville may go with this kind of intervention. So doing those needs assessments, speaking directly to the population that's at risk is critically important. And then it kind of comes down to, you know, issues of siting, coverage, different types of programs. I think mobile facilities, as you might have heard, can work quite well in areas where the population at risk is more dispersed because they can cover a wider area. And it's not only about the people, it's not only about supervising the consumption, which does have benefit, but a mobile service is also to extend some of those other harm reduction supplies or connections to health and SUD treatment services. So I think you can get a lot of bang for your buck out of a mobile type program. There are other innovations and technologies that are being developed that address solitary drug use in other types of environments, you know, wearable technologies, or there's a hotline called Never Use Alone that people can call. And then if there's no response after, say, 15 or 20 minutes, then that organization would have permission from the participant to have EMS services called on their behalf. So there's other interventions, I would say, to address solitary drug use in these very rural environments. So I hope that answers your question. I'm trying to think of any others. Oh, this is not something that is common in North America. There might be only one, but in Europe, actually integrating OPCs within hospitals is more common. That's done in Spain, I think, and Germany. I can dig up some examples of those. And they do a number of things. They typically are available for people who are at the emergency department having acute mental health or behavioral health issues, but might also be open and available as a service to people who are residing in the community as well. So integration into hospitals or other primary health clinics is reasonably cost effective because all of those extension and wraparound services already exist, right? So you're really just looking at building out a space for the immediate consumption, and then the rest is sort of already there, ideally, maybe staffing. But that's certainly another type of model to consider in non-urban environments.
I have additional questions, but happy to pause in case others.
Is there anyone else who has a question, or shall we let representatives?
I yield my time to representatives.
Continue. Yeah, please do.
Do you say, oh, you're heading. Okay. Dr. Marshall, it seems like you're getting more questions from me then.
Sorry.
About the immunity provisions, I know you didn't want to wade into the legal waters, but maybe just more generally, if you're able to share what immunity protections are in place currently if someone were to use the hopefully newly established OPC in Rhode Island.
Oh, I will have to look on for those actually. I don't have them offhand as they're written in the law, do you mean?
I'm happy to have you send that after the fact. It
Yeah.
was more thinking about if we're looking at immunity, it's for participants, the folks who are running the facility, volunteers, as well as property owners, knowing that folks typically have to contract out or
That's
rent.
right. Yeah. And what I do know actually is that this was done through essentially the framework of the Good Samaritan law in Rhode Island. So that law already provides immunity for people who, in good faith and without malice, witness an overdose and call 911, and they're protected from, legal intervention as a result. So that, I believe, is the framework that was essentially extended to the environments you're talking about, participants, staff, and owners of a building. So that was that I recall was the way that it was enacted, if that makes sense, was through that existing legal framework under the Good Sam provision. Yeah,
Well, that absolutely makes sense. That is what our framework is as well. So that's great to hear.
yeah.
And kind of in the liability realm, we also heard concern of someone coming in to use drugs and then sometime afterwards driving. Is there any research into incidents of motor vehicle crashes or any fatalities post using an overdose prevention center?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. The vast majority of people that use OPCs are not getting there with using a personal vehicle. It's something that we will assess in Rhode Island. It may be slightly different because we do have more of a suburban and lower density population of people. And the intention, as I mentioned, was to locate the service in Providence, but the organization does hope that people at risk for overdose in other municipalities may use it. So we are going to be collecting that information, but we anticipate that the vast majority will be accessing the site by walking or taking public transit. To answer your question, there really is very little or no research on this particular issue. And I don't think it's addressed. The issue is not actually addressed in our law either, but I can check that for you. What I've been told is that it would, again, I'm not a lawyer, but if you sort of applied the logic of bars, right, where like consumption of a substance is legal, if you leave that bar and are in a car accident, the bar is not typically held liable. So again, I'm going beyond my area of expertise. But I don't anticipate that is likely to be a problem for those two reasons. It's exceedingly rare to have people drive to one of these sites. And then I'm not confident legally that a site would even be held liable. Now, I should say you could consider regulations or policies or guidance that would recommend, if someone drove, they be observed for some period of time. You could at a policy or, intervention guidance level address this. I don't think that was done in Rhode Island, but I can double check as well in the regulations.
Thank you for that, and appreciate the comparison there to a bar. This seems very similar. And I think this is my last question. Looking at kind of priority populations, I think you mentioned this a bit before of folks who are typically using overdose prevention centers, such as folks who don't have regular access to transportation. What we heard yesterday from Dallas was that it was primarily unhoused folks or folks who were using a housing program who were utilizing, but didn't know if you had more kind of general evidence as to the specific populations that tend to access these sites.
Yes, that has been examined pretty extensively. In sum, really, the people that use these facilities are most at risk for overdose and overdose death. People, predictors of use include his lifetime history of overdose, housing instability, as you mentioned, and many have previous engagements with some sort of SUD treatment, but the vast majority or the majority are typically not actively engaged. So that's something they've really found to be the case in On Point, for example. I've heard, there senior director, Kaylin and Sama, told me the vast majority, almost all of their clients have some previous engagement with SUD treatment. It was either overwhelmingly negative or was not positive, or they were discontinued. Those people have so many complex histories of SUD treatment. And so their goal as a program is to, be there for people when they're ready to perhaps re-engage or talk about some other SUD treatment modality that might be appropriate for them. And so that's a critical way, I think, in which OPCs can help folks, engage with SUD treatment that might be appropriate for their level of care. So those are some of the most common predictors of OPC utilization. But I don't want to paint a homogeneous picture, if that makes sense. There are a small subset of people who, even in New York City, are of higher socioeconomic status, housed, and maybe have a new seller or uncertain about a specific substance that they might be using, and so choose to use an OPC at specific times when they feel that they might be at risk for overdose. So there is a subset of the population who uses it periodically based on their own assessment of risk, if that makes sense. So that is particularly important now when you think about the introduction of fentanyl into stimulants like crystal meth and cocaine, where overdose can be significant, particularly around a population with very little to no opioid tolerance. And so those populations are important to reach and can be reached by OPCs, in addition to people who have more severe opioid use disorder or unstably housed.
This has been extremely helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall.
Thank you. Is there any last final questions here? It's all set. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. I am just so impressed with the amount of data and information you have, which is so critical for all of us in states like Vermont, where we're really trying hard to have an impact on that first chart you showed us, which shows Vermont is very high in overdoses, and it's just great. And I'm excited to think that in Rhode Island, we're going to take a step forward. So thank you. Thank you very much for being with us again today.
It's my pleasure. I spend a lot of time thinking about OPCs these days. Our goal is to evaluate them rigorously and comprehensively as they open here. So I'm happy to share those data as we obtain them. And I'll follow up on some of these other pieces. And should I just send that to Lori as well?
Yes, that would be terrific.
Great.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, everybody.
Great. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so is there any last comments before we go offline till after lunch?